They called her just admin. A glorified secretary who fetched coffee, filed papers, and sat in the corner during briefings where decisions that shaped nations were made. For 3 years, Irene Hill had been invisible at the European Defense Coordination Center in Stuttgart, Germany. The officers walked past her desk without a glance. The colonels handed her folders without a word. She was furniture, background noise, utterly forgettable. Until the morning a 4-star general walked into a crisis briefing, scanned the room of panicked senior officers, and asked a question that changed everything. "What's her name?" "The admin girl in the corner." "Get her in here. Now." Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out, subscribe now for more. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the European Defense Coordination Center, casting geometric shadows across Irene Hill's immaculately organized desk. At 26, she had learned to make herself as neat and unobtrusive as the filing system she maintained. Her workstation sat in the outer corridor of the operations wing, positioned precisely where she could see everyone coming and going, but where no one ever really saw her. Irene arrived every morning at 6:30, a full hour before the officers began trickling in with their espresso cups and urgent conversations. She used that quiet time to review the previous day's classified briefing summaries, not because it was required of her duties, but because she couldn't help herself. While other administrative staff saw their jobs as typing, filing, and scheduling, Irene saw patterns. She noticed inconsistencies. She remembered details that others forgot the moment they left the briefing room. But no one asked for her observations. No one wanted input from the admin girl. Her official title was Administrative Specialist, Grade 3, which meant she supported the senior officers coordinating multinational defense operations across 17 European nations. In practice, it meant she was the woman who printed briefing packets, scheduled conference rooms, and reminded colonels about their meetings. She was efficient, quiet, and utterly invisible. The other administrative staff had learned to accept their roles. Katerina, who worked in the logistics section, spent her lunch breaks planning her wedding. Dmitri, who managed the IT help desk, counted down the days until his pension. They clocked in, did their jobs, and clocked out without ever wondering what happened in those classified briefings they weren't cleared to attend. Irene was different. She couldn't stop wondering. Every classified document that crossed her desk, every fragment of conversation she overheard while delivering files, every briefing summary she formatted and printed, she absorbed it all like a sponge. She began to see connections that others missed, patterns in the intelligence reports, gaps in the strategic assessments. At night, in her small apartment in Stuttgart's Vaihingen district, she would review her mental notes, creating detailed analyses that no one would ever read. She'd tried once to share her observations. 6 months into her assignment, she'd noticed a discrepancy in the logistics reports from the Baltic states. The numbers didn't match the stated troop movements. She'd carefully compiled her findings into a 2-page memo and left it on Colonel Brennan's desk with his morning briefing packet. He'd called her into his office the next day, the memo sitting on his desk like evidence of a crime. "Miss Hill," he'd said, his tone carrying the weight of disappointed authority, "your job is to format documents, not to analyze them. I appreciate your attention to detail, but strategic analysis is handled by our intelligence officers. Officers with years of training and security clearances you don't possess." "But sir," Irene had replied, her voice quiet but steady, "the discrepancy I identified could indicate." Colonel Brennan had raised his hand, cutting her off. "I understand you want to be helpful, but you're overstepping your role. Stick to your assigned duties. That's an order." Irene had left his office with burning cheeks and a knot in her stomach. She'd learned her lesson. No one wanted insights from the admin girl. They wanted their coffee hot, their meetings scheduled correctly, and their briefing packets printed on time. So she stopped offering. But she didn't stop noticing. The officers who worked in the European Defense Coordination Center were accomplished men and women, most with decades of military experience. General Hartmann, who commanded the Joint Operations Division, had served in 3 continents and advised 2 heads of state. Colonel Brennan had written the book, literally, on multinational logistics coordination. Major Kowalski had intelligence credentials that made her one of the most respected analysts in NATO. And then there was Irene Hill, who made sure their staplers were full and their coffee cups remained filled during long strategy sessions. She understood their dismissal, in a way. She had no military training, no advanced degrees in strategic studies, no combat experience to lend credibility to her observations. On paper, she was exactly what she appeared to be, a civilian administrative worker whose highest qualification was a bachelor's degree in European history from a modest university in Lyon. What they didn't know was that Irene had been preparing for something more since the day she'd accepted this position. Every night, she studied military strategy, read classified briefing summaries she technically wasn't supposed to retain, and taught herself to think like the analysts whose work she formatted. She learned Russian by listening to language podcasts during her lunch breaks. She taught herself the intricacies of NATO protocol and the political dynamics of 17 different European nations. She did all of this not because anyone asked, but because she couldn't imagine doing anything less. The other administrative staff thought she was odd. Why stay late reviewing documents that weren't your responsibility? Why spend weekends reading defense policy journals? Why care so much about a job that barely paid enough to cover rent in expensive Stuttgart? Irene couldn't explain it to them. She barely understood it herself. All she knew was that somewhere deep inside, she believed that preparation would eventually meet opportunity. She just had to be ready when it arrived. This morning, like every morning, Irene began her day by reviewing the overnight intelligence summaries. Technically, these summaries were classified, and technically, she only had access to them for formatting and distribution purposes. But no one monitored how carefully she read them before printing. Today's summary made her pause. There was something off about the troop movement reports from the eastern border. The numbers were consistent with previous days, but the timing seemed wrong. Units that should have rotated out remained in position. Supply requisitions didn't match the stated operational tempo. Irene made a mental note, just as she had hundreds of times before. Another pattern, another discrepancy, another observation that no one wanted to hear. She printed the briefing packets, 23 copies for this morning's coordination meeting, and arranged them in the conference room exactly 15 minutes before the scheduled start time. The officers would arrive, collect their packets, and spend 90 minutes discussing strategies that Irene could probably recite from memory. And she would sit at her desk outside, invisible and unheard, waiting for the meeting to end so she could collect the classified materials and return them to the secure filing room. Just another normal day at the European Defense Coordination Center, where Irene Hill was just admin. The morning briefing began precisely at 8 o'clock, as it did every Tuesday and Thursday. Irene could hear the murmur of voices through the conference room's heavy door, the occasional sharp tone of disagreement, the shuffle of papers as officers reviewed the materials she'd prepared. She returned to her desk and opened her email, responding to scheduling requests and supply requisitions with practiced efficiency. At 8:47, Major Kowalski emerged from the conference room, her expression tight with frustration. She walked past Irene's desk without acknowledgement and disappeared into her private office, closing the door with more force than necessary. Something was wrong in the briefing. Irene's fingers paused over her keyboard. She glanced toward the conference room, then back to her computer screen. Not your concern, she reminded herself. Colonel Brennan had made that abundantly clear. By 9:30, the briefing should have concluded, but voices still rose and fell behind the conference room door. Irene heard General Hartmann's distinctive baritone, sharp with irritation. Then Colonel Brennan's calmer tones attempting to mediate. The meeting was running long, which meant complications. At 10:15, the conference room door finally opened. Officers filed out in small groups, their conversations hushed and urgent. Irene kept her eyes on her computer screen, but her attention tracked every word she could catch. The intelligence doesn't match the logistics reports, someone muttered. Either our sources are wrong, or someone's feeding us bad information. We need verification before we brief the council, another voice replied. But from where? Our usual channels are compromised. Irene's pulse quickened. She knew exactly what they were discussing. The discrepancies she'd noticed in this morning's intelligence summary weren't just administrative errors. They were significant enough to derail a major strategic briefing. The last officer left the conference room, and Irene waited the required 10 minutes before entering to collect the classified materials. The room still smelled of coffee and tension. Briefing packets lay scattered across the long table, some annotated with urgent notes in the margins. She began gathering them methodically, but her eyes caught on Colonel Brennan's packet, left open to a page she'd formatted yesterday. There, in his precise handwriting, was a note that made her breath catch: Eastern border numbers don't reconcile. Need verification ASAP. Risk of council briefing failure. Irene stood frozen, the packet in her hands. She knew what those numbers meant. She'd seen the pattern forming over the past 3 weeks, noticed the subtle shifts that didn't match the official reports. But more than that, she knew where the discrepancy originated. For the past month, she'd been formatting reports from 3 different intelligence sources: Romanian border surveillance, Polish logistics coordination, and German reconnaissance analysis. Each source used slightly different classification systems and reporting timelines. When she'd formatted them for the briefing packets, she'd noticed that they weren't synchronized. The Romanian reports ran 24 hours behind the Polish data, and the German analysis used a different methodology for counting equipment movements. No one else had noticed because no one else formatted all 3 reports. The intelligence analysts worked in separate sections. The officers received the compiled summaries without seeing the source documents. Only Irene, the invisible admin girl who prepared the briefing packets, had seen all 3 sources side by side. And only Irene had realized that when you synchronized the timelines and standardized the counting methodology, the numbers told a completely different story than the one the officers were debating. She should tell someone. The responsible thing would be to approach Colonel Brennan, explain what she'd noticed, and let the proper authorities handle it. But she remembered his expression when she tried to help before, the dismissive tone, the clear message that her observations weren't welcome. Irene returned to her desk with the classified materials and sat down, her mind racing. The council briefing was scheduled for tomorrow morning. If the officers presented intelligence based on unsynchronized data, they would make strategic recommendations based on faulty information. The consequences could range from embarrassing to dangerous, depending on how wrong their analysis was. She opened a new document on her computer and began typing. Not a memo this time, but a detailed analysis showing exactly how the 3 intelligence sources needed to be synchronized. She included timeline adjustments, methodology conversions, and the corrected numbers that resulted from proper alignment. 2 hours later, she had a 6-page report that clearly demonstrated the problem and provided the solution. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Send it to Colonel Brennan? Leave it on General Hartmann's desk? Or accept that no one wanted help from the admin girl and delete the entire thing? Before she could decide, her phone rang. Colonel Brennan's extension. Miss Hill, I need you to prepare an emergency briefing packet for General Hartmann. He's meeting with the Strategic Council liaison in 30 minutes. The same intelligence summaries as this morning's briefing, sir? Yes, exactly the same. And make it fast. Irene hung up and stared at her computer screen. The colonel wanted her to prepare a briefing packet she knew contained unsynchronized data that would lead to flawed analysis. If she just did her job, just followed orders like a good admin specialist, she would be complicit in presenting bad intelligence to senior leadership. She thought about the memo she'd written, sitting in her drafts folder. Thought about Colonel Brennan's dismissal 6 months ago. Thought about 3 years of being invisible, ignored, and underestimated. Then she thought about what would happen if the Strategic Council made decisions based on faulty information. Irene pulled up the emergency briefing packet template and began working. But this time, she didn't just format the documents. She synchronized the timelines. She standardized the methodologies. She corrected the numbers. And she included a single-page appendix, formatted to look like part of the official intelligence summary, that explained exactly what adjustments had been made and why. It was the kind of thing an intelligence analyst would do. Not something an admin specialist was authorized to do. If anyone noticed, if anyone questioned it, her career at the European Defense Coordination Center would be over. But if no one noticed, General Hartmann would walk into his meeting with accurate information instead of flawed data. Irene printed the packet, placed it in a security envelope, and walked it to General Hartmann's office. His aide accepted it without comment, and Irene returned to her desk with her heart pounding. She'd just crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She'd made a decision that wasn't hers to make, altered intelligence documents without authorization, and inserted her own analysis into materials meant for senior leadership. For the next 30 minutes, she sat at her desk trying to look busy while her mind raced with possibilities. Would they notice the changes? Would they trace them back to her? Would she be fired? Prosecuted? At 4:30, her phone rang again. General Hartmann's aide, his voice clipped and urgent. "Miss Hill, the general needs to see you immediately. Conference room B." Irene's stomach dropped. This was it. They'd discovered what she'd done. She stood on shaking legs and walked toward conference room B, each step feeling like a march toward execution. When she opened the door, she found General Hartmann sitting alone at the table, her briefing packet open in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable. "Close the door," he said. Irene did, then stood at attention, waiting for the consequences of her unauthorized actions. The general gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Miss Hill. We need to talk about this briefing packet you prepared." Irene sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. General Hartmann studied her with the same intensity he probably used to evaluate strategic threats. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable. "This briefing packet," he finally said, tapping the document with one finger, "is different from the materials presented in this morning's coordination meeting. The numbers have been adjusted. The timelines have been synchronized. And there's an appendix here that wasn't in the original intelligence summaries." "Yes, sir," Irene managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you make these changes?" There was no point in lying. "Yes, sir, I did." Hartmann leaned back in his chair, his expression giving nothing away. "And what gave you the authority to alter classified intelligence documents?" Irene's mouth went dry. "Nothing gave me that authority, sir. I overstepped my role. I noticed that the 3 source reports weren't synchronized, and I knew the discrepancies would affect the analysis, and I thought." "You thought you knew better than our intelligence analysts? Than Colonel Brennan? Than me?" The words hit like accusations, and Irene felt her carefully constructed professional composure beginning to crack. "No, sir. I just noticed something that I thought might be important. I know I should have reported it through proper channels, but I remembered what happened last time I tried to offer analysis, and I was afraid no one would listen, and the council briefing is tomorrow, and I just—" "Miss Hill." Hartmann's voice cut through a rambling explanation. "Take a breath." Irene stopped, inhaled shakily, and met the general's eyes. She expected to see anger, but what she found was something else entirely. Curiosity, perhaps. Or assessment. "Tell me exactly what you noticed," Hartmann said. "And explain your methodology for these corrections." For the next 20 minutes, Irene explained everything. How she'd been formatting reports from 3 different intelligence sources for months. How she'd noticed each source used different timelines and counting methodologies. How the discrepancies had been growing over the past 3 weeks. How synchronizing the data revealed a pattern that the unsynchronized summaries had obscured. She showed him the timeline adjustments, walked him through the methodology conversions, and demonstrated how the corrected numbers painted a different picture of the eastern border situation. As she spoke, her nervousness faded, replaced by the confidence that came from knowing she was right. When she finished, Hartmann was silent for a long moment. Then he picked up his phone and dialed an extension. "Colonel Brennan, I need you in conference room B immediately." And bring Major Kowalski with you. Irene's brief moment of confidence evaporated. Now she would face not just the general, but the officers she'd essentially contradicted with her unauthorized analysis. Colonel Brennan and Major Kowalski arrived within minutes. Both looked confused to see Irene sitting at the conference table rather than standing in the corner where admin staff belonged. "Colonel," Hartman said without preamble, "I need you to review this briefing packet. Specifically, I need you to verify the analysis in the appendix." Brennan took the packet, his eyes widening as he scanned the contents. Major Kowalski leaned over his shoulder, her expression shifting from confusion to intense concentration. "This is..." Brennan began, then stopped, reading more carefully. "This methodology alignment, it changes everything. Where did this analysis come from?" Kowalski asked, looking at Hartman. The general nodded toward Irene. "Miss Hill prepared it." Both officers turned to stare at her. "The admin specialist?" Brennan's tone carried disbelief. "The same admin specialist who tried to report a logistics discrepancy to you 6 months ago," Hartman replied, his voice carrying a note of reproach. "The one you told to stick to her assigned duties." Brennan had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Sir, I didn't realize." "No, you didn't," Hartman interrupted. "None of us did." He turned back to Irene. "Miss Hill, I need you to brief Colonel Brennan and Major Kowalski on everything you just explained to me. They'll verify your analysis before tomorrow's council briefing." The verification process took 6 hours. Irene sat in conference room B while Colonel Brennan and Major Kowalski systematically checked every calculation, every timeline adjustment, every methodology conversion she'd made. Other analysts were called in. Source documents were retrieved from secure archives. Phone calls were made to intelligence contacts in Romania, Poland, and Germany. Through it all, Irene answered questions with a precision that surprised even herself. She'd spent 3 years absorbing information that no one thought she was paying attention to, and now every detail she'd mentally filed away came flooding back. She knew which Romanian surveillance post had been offline on specific dates. She remembered when the Polish logistics system had updated its counting methodology. She could cite the exact German intelligence directive that had changed their reporting timeline. Major Kowalski, initially skeptical, became increasingly engaged. "You've been tracking these source variations for how long?" "Since I started formatting the reports," Irene replied. "About 14 months. And you never mentioned this to anyone?" "I tried once," Irene said quietly, glancing at Colonel Brennan. "I was told to focus on my assigned duties." Brennan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He continued checking Irene's calculations against the raw intelligence data, his expression growing more troubled with each verification. By midnight, the conclusion was unavoidable. Irene's analysis was correct. The unsynchronized intelligence summaries had been creating a systematically distorted picture of eastern border activities for months. Every strategic assessment, every briefing to senior leadership, every recommendation made based on those summaries had been built on flawed data. "We've been operating blind," Kowalski said, her voice hollow. "All those briefings, all those strategy sessions, we were working with garbage data." "Not entirely garbage," Irene offered carefully. "The individual sources were accurate. They just weren't properly aligned. It's like looking at 3 photographs of the same scene taken at different times and trying to understand what's happening. If you don't account for the time differences, the picture makes no sense." Hartman, who'd been observing the verification process from the back of the room, finally spoke. "Miss Hill, why didn't you push harder when Colonel Brennan dismissed your concerns 6 months ago?" Irene considered the question. "Because I'm admin staff, sir. I format documents and schedule meetings. I have no credentials, no authority, no reason anyone should listen to me. Colonel Brennan was right to dismiss me. I was overstepping my role." "Were you?" Hartman asked. "Or were you doing exactly what any good intelligence analyst should do, noticing patterns and reporting discrepancies? The difference is that intelligence analysts are trained and authorized to do that work," Irene replied. "I'm not." Training and authorization don't mean much if they produce faulty analysis, Kowalski interjected. She looked at Irene with something approaching respect. How did you learn to do this kind of work? I read, Irene said simply. Intelligence journals, strategic assessments, classified briefing summaries that crossed my desk. I taught myself because no one was going to teach me. The room fell silent. Then Brennan cleared his throat. Sir, we need to brief the Strategic Council on this situation before tomorrow's presentation. They need to know that our previous assessments were based on unsynchronized data. Agreed, Hartman said. He looked at Irene. Miss Hill, you'll participate in that briefing. You're the only person who fully understands the scope of this problem. Sir, I'm not cleared for Strategic Council briefings, Irene protested. You are now, Hartman replied. Consider yourself temporarily assigned to the intelligence analysis team. We'll formalize the paperwork later. Irene felt the room tilt slightly. 3 years of being invisible, and now she was being assigned to brief the Strategic Council. It didn't seem real. Get some rest, Hartman ordered. The briefing starts at 0800. Miss Hill, I'll need you here at 0730 to review the presentation materials. As the officers filed out, Kowalski paused beside Irene's chair. For what it's worth, you were right to make those corrections. You probably saved us from making a serious strategic error. I just did what needed to be done, Irene replied. Kowalski smiled slightly. That's what good intelligence analysts do. Welcome to the team. Irene didn't sleep that night. She returned to her apartment, showered, changed into a fresh uniform, and sat at her small kitchen table reviewing her notes. At 0500, she gave up on the pretense of rest and returned to the European Defense Coordination Center. The building felt different in the pre-dawn darkness. For 3 years, she'd arrived early to prepare for a day of invisibility. This morning, she was preparing to brief senior leaders on intelligence failures that her analysis had uncovered. The shift felt surreal. At 0730, Irene entered Conference Room A, the largest briefing space in the facility. General Hartman was already there, reviewing presentation slides with his aide. He nodded as she entered. Miss Hill, walk me through the briefing structure. I want to make sure we present this clearly. For the next 30 minutes, Irene outlined how she planned to explain the intelligence synchronization problem. She suggested starting with a simple example, showing how the same data looked different depending on timeline alignment, then building to the more complex implications for strategic assessment. Hartman listened carefully, occasionally asking questions or suggesting modifications. He treated her input with the same seriousness he would give any analyst, and Irene felt something shift inside her. This was what respect felt like. This was what it meant to be valued for her mind rather than dismissed because of her title. At 0800 sharp, the Strategic Council liaison officers began arriving. These were senior leaders from multiple European nations, officers whose decisions shaped continental defense policy. They took their seats around the massive conference table, and Irene felt her stomach clench with nervousness. Then the door opened, and a 4-star general entered. General Wilhelm von Kessler, Supreme Allied Commander for European Operations. Every officer in the room stood at attention. Von Kessler was a legend, a strategic genius who'd coordinated 3 major multinational operations and advised heads of state across Europe. Irene had never seen him in person. He rarely visited the coordination center, operating instead from the Supreme headquarters in Belgium. His presence meant this briefing had escalated far beyond routine intelligence review. Von Kessler took his seat at the head of the table and surveyed the room with sharp eyes that seemed to catalog every detail. General Hartman, I understand we have a significant intelligence problem to address. Yes, sir, Hartman replied. We've discovered systematic errors in our eastern border assessments. Errors that have affected our strategic recommendations for several months. How was this discovered? Hartman gestured toward Irene, who stood near the presentation screen. One of our administrative specialists identified discrepancies in the source data synchronization. Von Kessler's gaze shifted to Irene. His expression was unreadable, but his attention was absolute. He studied her for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. Then he asked the question that would change everything. "What's her name?" The room fell silent. Every officer turned to look at Irene, many seeming to notice her for the first time despite 3 years of her presence at the facility. "Specialist Irene Hill, sir," Hartmann replied. Von Kessler continued to study her. "And she's administrative staff?" "Yes, sir. She formats briefing documents and manages classified materials distribution." The general's eyebrows rose slightly. "Administrative staff identified systematic intelligence failures that our trained analysts missed." The silence in the room was deafening. Colonel Brennan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Major Kowalski stared at the table. The liaison officers exchanged glances. "Yes, sir," Hartmann confirmed. "Specialist Hill has been tracking source data variations for over a year. She noticed patterns that became visible only when formatting reports from multiple intelligence streams." Von Kessler leaned back in his chair. "Fascinating." He looked directly at Irene. "Specialist Hill, brief us on what you discovered." Irene stepped to the presentation screen, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. She prepared for this moment, had rehearsed her explanation in the early morning hours. But standing before Supreme Allied Commander von Kessler in a room full of senior officers was different from practicing alone in her apartment. She began with the simple example she'd prepared, showing 2 slides side by side. The first displayed intelligence data as it appeared in the standard briefing summaries. The second showed the same data after timeline synchronization. The difference was stark. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and professional, "what you're seeing is the same border activity reported by 3 different intelligence sources. On the left, the data as it appears in our current briefing format. On the right, the same data after accounting for reporting timeline differences and methodology variations." One of the liaison officers leaned forward. "The numbers are completely different." "Not completely," Irene corrected. "The individual data points are accurate. But the relationship between them changes when you account for the fact that Romanian surveillance reports with a 24-hour delay, Polish logistics updates in real time, and German reconnaissance uses a 48-hour analytical window." She advanced to the next slide, showing the pattern over 3 months. When the timelines are aligned, you can see that what appeared to be random equipment movements actually represents a coordinated repositioning pattern. One that's been invisible in our unsynchronized summaries. For the next 40 minutes, Irene walked the council through her analysis. She explained how she discovered the synchronization problem, demonstrated the methodology she developed to correct it, and outlined the implications for previous strategic assessments. Von Kessler asked pointed questions throughout, testing her understanding of intelligence methodology and strategic implications. Irene answered each one with confidence born from 3 years of obsessive study. She knew this material better than anyone in the room because she'd been living with it while everyone else had been relying on summaries she'd prepared. When she finished, the room was silent. Then Von Kessler spoke. "Specialist Hill, how long have you been aware of this synchronization problem?" "I first noticed discrepancies about 14 months ago, sir." "And you reported this to your superiors?" Irene glanced at Colonel Brennan. "I attempted to report a related concern 6 months ago, sir. I was instructed to focus on my assigned administrative duties." Von Kessler's expression hardened. He turned to Brennan. "Colonel, is this accurate?" Brennan stood, his face flushed. "Sir, Specialist Hill did bring a logistics concern to my attention. At the time, I didn't realize the scope of what she was identifying. I thought she was overstepping her role." "You were correct," Von Kessler said coldly. "She was overstepping her role. The question is why that was necessary. Why wasn't our intelligence analysis team identifying these discrepancies?" The silence that followed was damning. Major Kowalski finally spoke. "Sir, we've been treating the source data as pre-synchronized. We never questioned the briefing summaries because we trusted the administrative formatting process. You trusted the formatting, von Kessler repeated, but ignored the formatter who noticed your data was flawed. He looked around the room. Does anyone else see the problem here? More silence. Then Hartmann spoke. Sir, we systematically dismissed valuable intelligence insight because it came from someone we'd categorized as administrative support rather than analytical staff. Von Kessler nodded. That's exactly the problem. He turned back to Irene. Specialist Hill, what's your educational background? Bachelor's degree in European history from the University of Lyon, sir. Military training? None, sir. I'm civilian staff. Intelligence analysis credentials? Irene hesitated, then answered honestly. None, sir. Everything I know, I taught myself. Von Kessler smiled, a cold expression that made several officers shift uncomfortably. So a civilian with a history degree and no formal training identified systematic intelligence failures that our credentialed analysts missed for over a year. He stood, and every officer in the room came to attention. This briefing is concluded. General Hartmann, I want a full review of our intelligence analysis protocols. I want to know how this happened and what we're going to do to ensure it never happens again. Yes, sir. Von Kessler walked toward the door, then paused. He turned back to look at Irene, who still stood near the presentation screen. Specialist Hill, what's your current assignment? Administrative support for the operations wing, sir. Not anymore, von Kessler said. Effective immediately, you're reassigned to the Intelligence Analysis Division. General Hartmann will arrange the details. He paused. And Specialist Hill, next time you notice something, don't wait for permission to report it. That's an order. Yes, sir, Irene managed. Von Kessler left the room, and slowly, the other officers began to file out. Several nodded to Irene as they passed, acknowledgement from men who'd walked past her desk for 3 years without seeing her. When the room was empty except for Hartmann, he approached Irene with an expression that mixed approval and concern. Congratulations, Miss Hill. You just impressed one of the most difficult commanders in European military history. I hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. The Intelligence Analysis Division occupied the 3rd floor of the European Defense Coordination Center, a space Irene had walked past countless times but never entered. Now, on Monday morning, she stood outside the security door with her new credentials, feeling like an imposter about to be exposed. The division chief, Lieutenant Colonel Andreas Weber, met her at the entrance. His handshake was firm but his expression carried skepticism barely concealed behind professional courtesy. Weber was a career intelligence officer with 20 years of experience and a reputation for running the tightest analytical operation in European defense. Welcome to the division, Specialist Hill, he said, gesturing for her to follow him into the main operations room. I understand your reassignment came directly from General von Kessler. Yes, sir, Irene replied, noting the emphasis he placed on your reassignment as if it were something that had happened to him rather than something he'd chosen. The operations room was a stark contrast to the administrative offices where she'd spent 3 years. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds from across Europe. Analysts sat at workstations equipped with secure terminals and encrypted communications equipment. The air hummed with focused intensity. Weber led her to a desk position near the back of the room. This will be your workspace. You'll be assigned to the Eastern Europe Analytical Team under Senior Analyst Kamensky. Your initial focus will be on continuing the synchronization methodology you developed. Irene looked at the desk, noting its position in the corner, away from the main analytical clusters. A familiar placement. Still on the periphery, still separated from the core team, the other analysts glanced up as Weber introduced her, their expressions ranging from curious to openly dismissive. She recognized the look. The admin girl who'd gotten lucky, now playing at being an intelligence professional. Kamensky approached, a compact man in his 40s with the weathered look of someone who'd spent years in field intelligence. So you're the one who found the synchronization problem, he said, his tone neutraled. I identified some discrepancies. Irene replied carefully, discrepancies that made our entire analytical division look incompetent in front of the Supreme Allied Commander, Kaminsky said. His tone remained neutral, but the words carried an edge. That wasn't my intention, sir. Intentions don't matter much in intelligence work, Kaminsky replied. Results matter. Can you replicate your synchronization methodology across other intelligence streams? Yes, sir. I believe the same principles apply to most multinational source data. Then that's what you'll do. Start with the Balkan intelligence feeds. Show me your methodology works beyond the Eastern Border data. He paused, studying her. And Miss Hill, understand something. General von Kessler's endorsement got you this position, but it won't keep you here. You'll be evaluated the same way every analyst is evaluated, by the quality and reliability of your work. I understand, sir. Kaminsky nodded and returned to his workstation, leaving Irene alone at her corner desk. She logged into her new terminal and began accessing the Balkan intelligence feeds. The interface was different from the administrative systems she'd used, more complex and requiring security protocols she had to learn on the FLY.BY noon. She'd made minimal progress. The Balkan data structure was more complicated than the Eastern Border feeds, involving intelligence sources from 7 different nations, each with unique reporting standards. Every time she thought she'd identified a synchronization pattern, she discovered another variable that complicated the analysis. Around her, the other analysts worked with practiced efficiency. They spoke in shorthand she didn't understand, referenced protocols she'd never heard of, and operated with the confidence of people who belonged in this environment. Irene felt the familiar isolation settling over her. Different room, different title, same invisibility. At 1,500 hours, Weber called a division briefing. The analysts gathered around a central display as he outlined new taskings from European Command. Irene stood at the back, taking notes and trying to absorb the operational terminology being thrown around. As the briefing concluded, Weber looked directly at her. Specialist Hill, where are we on the Balkan synchronization analysis? Still in the preliminary stages, sir, Irene replied. The data structure is more complex than I initially anticipated. How long until you have preliminary results? Irene hesitated. Being honest might make her look incompetent. Overpromising would be worse. At least another week to properly map the source variations. We don't have a week, Weber said flatly. The Balkan assessment brief is scheduled for Thursday. I need your synchronization methodology applied to that data by Wednesday morning. 48 hours. Irene's stomach sank. Yes, sir. I'll have it ready. Irene worked through the night, sustained by coffee and the stubborn determination that had carried her through 3 years of administrative invisibility. The Balkan intelligence feeds sprawled across her screen in a chaotic web of data points, timelines, and conflicting methodologies. 7 different nations, 14 different intelligence sources, and at least 20 distinct reporting protocols. BY0300, she'd identified the core synchronization problem. The Balkan nations were using 3 different standard time references, 2 different equipment counting methodologies, and reporting cycles that ranged from real-time updates to 72-hour analytical summaries. Aligning them required not just timeline adjustments, but fundamental conversions of how the data was categorized and measured. She built a framework similar to what she developed for the Eastern Border analysis, but more complex. Each intelligence source needed its own conversion protocol. Each timeline required specific adjustments. And every synchronization point had to be verified against multiple data sets to ensure accuracy. The division operations room began filling with analysts around 0600. Kaminsky arrived, noticed Irene still at her desk in yesterday's uniform, and raised an eyebrow. You've been here all night. The timeline was tight, sir, Irene replied, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Kaminsky walked over to her workstation and studied her screen. Show me what you have. For the next hour, Irene walked him through her Balkan synchronization framework. She demonstrated how the unsynchronized data created apparent patterns that disappeared when properly aligned, and how the synchronized data revealed actual operational movements that had been invisible in the standard briefing summaries. Kaminsky asked technical questions, probing her methodology for weaknesses. Irene answered each one, showing him the verification protocols she'd built in, the error-checking mechanisms, the confidence levels for different synchronization points. When she finished, Kaminsky was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "This is solid work, Hill. Better than I expected." Honestly, the compliment felt significant coming from someone who'd been openly skeptical of her assignment, but, Kaminsky continued, "You've only synchronized historical data. Can this framework process new intelligence in real time?" Irene hadn't gotten that far. "Not yet, sir. I focused on proving the methodology first." "Proving methodology is good," Kaminsky said. "But operational value comes from real-time application. If we have to wait for you to manually synchronize data, your analysis is always going to be backwards-looking." He was right. Irene had solved the problem of understanding what had already happened, but intelligence work required understanding what was happening now and predicting what would happen next. "I could automate the synchronization process," she offered. "Build algorithms that apply the conversion protocols automatically as new data arrives." "Can you code?" "I've taught myself some basic programming," Irene admitted. "But nothing at the level this would require." Kaminsky considered this. "We have technical specialists who handle automated systems. But they'd need to understand your methodology to code it properly." He looked at her critically. "Could you work with them? Translate your analytical framework into technical specifications?" "Yes, sir." "Then that's your next task. Werner in technical operations can help you. Get your synchronization framework automated before the Thursday briefing." He paused. "And Hill, go home. Shower. Sleep for a few hours. You're no good to anyone if you're too exhausted to think clearly." Irene returned to her apartment, showered, and collapsed into bed. She managed 4 hours of sleep before her mind started racing again, thinking about automation algorithms and verification protocols. By 1400, she was back at the division, meeting with Werner and his technical team. Werner was a civilian contractor, a software engineer who'd been supporting intelligence operations for a decade. He listened to Irene's explanation of her synchronization methodology with the focused attention of someone solving a complex puzzle. "This is elegant," he said finally, reviewing her framework documentation. "You've essentially created a translator that converts multiple intelligence dialects into a single standardized language." "That's exactly what it is," Irene replied, relieved that he understood. "Coding this will take time," Werner warned. "The number of variables and conversion protocols you've built in, we're looking at weeks of development and testing." "We have 2 days," Irene said. Werner laughed, then realized she was serious. "That's impossible. We can't build and test a system this complex in 48 hours, then we build a partial system," Irene replied. "We automate the most critical synchronization points and handle the edge cases manually. It won't be perfect, but it'll be faster than full manual processing." Werner studied her for a moment, then grinned. "You know what? I like how you think. Let's see what we can do." They worked through the night again, Irene explaining her analytical logic while Werner translated it into code. By Wednesday morning, they had a functioning prototype that could automate roughly 70% of the synchronization process. The remaining 30% still required human judgment, but even partial automation represented a massive improvement in processing speed. The Thursday briefing began at 0800 with Weber presenting the Balkan assessment to a room full of senior officers including General Hartmann and several NATO liaison representatives. Irene sat near the back, her automated synchronization system running on a secure laptop, processing intelligence feeds in real time. Weber's presentation covered the standard strategic overview, political dynamics, military posture assessments. Then he reached the intelligence analysis section, and the mood in the room shifted. "Our previous Balkan assessments," Weber began, "suffered from the same synchronization problems Specialist Hill identified in the Eastern Border analysis. This week, we applied her methodology to the Balkan intelligence streams." He displayed a comparison slide showing the unsynchronized data versus the synchronized analysis. The differences were dramatic. What had appeared to be random military exercises now showed clear patterns of coordinated positioning. Equipment movements that had seemed routine now revealed systematic repositioning toward specific border sectors. One of the NATO liaison officers leaned forward. This suggests a completely different threat assessment than what we've been operating under. Correct, Weber confirmed. The synchronized data indicates preparation for potential rapid deployment, not the defensive posturing our previous analysis suggested. General Hartmann turned to look at Irene. How confident are we in this new analysis? Before Weber could answer, an alert flashed on Irene's laptop. New intelligence had just arrived from Serbian border surveillance. She watched as her automated system processed the data, applied the synchronization protocols, and flagged an anomaly. Her heart rate spiked. The pattern she was seeing didn't match anything in the existing analysis. "Excuse me, sir," she said, standing up. Her voice carried across the briefing room. "We just received new intelligence that contradicts our current assessment." Every head turned toward her. Weber's expression showed surprise mixed with concern. "What kind of contradiction?" Hartmann asked. Irene connected her laptop to the main display and brought up the real-time synchronization analysis. The automated system just flagged unusual movement patterns at 3 separate border points. When synchronized with Polish reconnaissance data from 6 hours ago and Romanian surveillance from this morning, it shows coordinated withdrawal, not deployment preparation. The room erupted in murmurs. Withdrawal meant something completely different from deployment. It suggested de-escalation rather than threat buildup. Weber moved to the display, studying Irene's analysis. "Are you certain about this synchronization?" Irene pulled up the verification protocols. "The confidence levels are 85% or higher across all 3 data points, sir. And the pattern is consistent with previous withdrawal operations we've observed in this region." One of the NATO liaison officers stood. "If this analysis is correct, we need to update our strategic recommendations immediately. We're about to advise the alliance to increase defensive posturing when we should be considering diplomatic engagement opportunities." Hartmann looked at Irene. "How long have you been tracking this withdrawal pattern?" "The automated system flagged it 17 minutes ago, sir," Irene replied. "I've been running verification protocols since then." "You're telling me that an automated system you built in 2 days is providing real-time strategic intelligence that changes our entire assessment?" The question came from a colonel Irene didn't recognize, his tone skeptical. "Not just the automated system," Irene replied. "The system flags patterns. I verify them against historical data and apply analytical judgment to determine significance. This withdrawal pattern matches 3 previous de-escalation operations from the same units over the past 18 months. Weber studied the display, then nodded. "She's right. I remember these previous operations. The pattern match is solid." Hartmann stood. "We need to brief the Strategic Council on this immediately. Weber, prepare an updated assessment. Hill, you'll present the real-time synchronization analysis." "Sir," Weber interjected, "perhaps I should present." "No," Hartmann interrupted. "This is Hill's methodology and her real-time analysis. She presents." 2 hours later, Irene stood before the Strategic Council again, this time presenting intelligence that could shift alliance policy. General von Kessler sat at the head of the table, his expression giving nothing away as she walked through the withdrawal pattern analysis. When she finished, he asked a single question. "What's your recommendation?" Irene hadn't expected to be asked for a strategic recommendation. She was an analyst, not a policy advisor. But von Kessler was waiting, and the room was silent. "Sir, the withdrawal pattern suggests an opportunity for diplomatic engagement. If we match their de-escalation with our own measured response, we might establish a precedent for cooperative security dialogue." Von Kessler nodded. "That's exactly what I think as well." He looked around the table. "We'll pursue diplomatic channels while maintaining defensive readiness." He turned back to Irene. "Good work, Specialist Hill." 6 months after her reassignment to intelligence analysis, Irene sat in the division operations room processing real-time intelligence feeds with an efficiency that had become routine. Her automated synchronization system had been expanded to cover intelligence streams across all of Europe, and her analytical methodology had been adopted as standard protocol for multinational data integration. The corner desk she'd been assigned on her first day was gone. She now worked at a central workstation, surrounded by other analysts who'd learned to value her unique ability to see patterns that eluded conventional analysis. Kaminsky had become not just her supervisor but her mentor, teaching her the nuances of intelligence tradecraft that couldn't be learned from books. The division had changed too. Weber had implemented new protocols for identifying and developing analytical talent, regardless of where it came from. 2 administrative specialists and a logistics coordinator had been given opportunities to train in intelligence analysis, their pattern recognition skills valued rather than dismissed. But some things remained familiar. Irene still arrived early, still studied intelligence summaries that technically weren't required reading, still prepared herself for challenges she couldn't predict. The difference was that now her preparation was expected rather than questioned. On this particular morning, she was reviewing German reconnaissance data when her phone rang. General Hartmann's office, requesting her presence immediately. She found Hartmann in his office with Colonel Weber and a woman in civilian clothes she didn't recognize. The woman carried herself with the quiet authority of someone used to operating in classified environments. Specialist Hill, Hartmann began, this is Director Russo from European Intelligence Coordination. She has a proposal for you. Russo smiled and gestured to a chair. Please, sit. I've been following your work with great interest. Your synchronization methodology has applications beyond military intelligence. Irene sat, confused about where this was going. We're establishing a new analytical team focused on cross-border intelligence integration, Russo continued. Economic data, criminal networks, political movements, all the intelligence streams that don't fit neatly into military categories but still affect European security. Your ability to see patterns across disparate data sources is exactly what we need. You're offering me a position? Irene asked. I'm offering you the opportunity to build something new, Russo replied. You'd lead a team of analysts working on intelligence problems that don't have established solutions. It would mean leaving military intelligence and transitioning to civilian strategic analysis. Irene looked at Hartmann and Weber, trying to read their expressions. Do you think I should take this? Hartmann smiled. I think you should do what challenges you most. You've already transformed how we approach military intelligence analysis. Maybe it's time to see what else you can transform. Weber nodded. You've earned this opportunity, Hill. Whatever you decide, you've already proven that titles don't determine capabilities. Irene thought about the 3 years she'd spent being invisible, dismissed as just admin, thought about the moment General von Kessler had asked her name, the moment everything changed. Thought about all the patterns she could see, all the problems she might solve if given the chance. When do I start? She asked Russo. 3 weeks later, Irene stood in a new office overlooking Stuttgart, leading her first briefing for a team of analysts she'd personally selected. Some came from military intelligence, others from civilian agencies, and 2 were former administrative specialists who'd shown pattern recognition abilities that conventional evaluation had missed. As she walked them through their first analytical challenge, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. From admin girl who formatted documents to intelligence analyst who briefed generals to team leader who was building something entirely new. Her phone buzzed with a message. General von Kessler requesting a briefing on her new team's preliminary findings. She smiled, remembering that first Strategic Council briefing when he'd asked her name. She'd been Specialist Irene Hill then, someone trying to prove she was more than her title. Now she was simply Irene Hill, someone whose capabilities spoke for themselves. The admin girl who'd spent 3 years being invisible had learned the most important lesson of all. Recognition wasn't something you waited for others to give you. It was something you earned by refusing to accept the limitations others tried to impose. And once earned, it opened doors to possibilities she'd never imagined. As she prepared her briefing for von Kessler, Irene realized that her story wasn't about changing from admin to analyst. It was about finally being seen for who she'd always been, someone whose mind saw patterns others missed, whose determination refused to accept artificial boundaries, and whose worth had never depended on what others called her. They'd called her just admin. Until the day a 4-star general asked her name and saw what everyone else had missed. Now, she was writing her own story, one analysis at a time. As they reached her office, Russo paused. General von Kessler asked me to pass along a message. He says you've exceeded every expectation, and he's watching your career with great interest. Irene felt a warmth spread through her chest. Tell the general I appreciate his confidence. And that I'm just getting started. That evening, as her team celebrated their success, Irene stood by the window looking out over Brussels. Somewhere in this city, financial investigators were acting on intelligence her team had provided. Somewhere, a crisis had been averted because people who'd been dismissed as just admin or just clerks had been given the chance to show what they could really do. 1 year after General von Kessler asked her name, Irene returned to the European Defense Coordination Center in Stuttgart. Not as an administrative specialist formatting documents in the outer corridor, but as the director of the Cross-Border Intelligence Integration Team, invited to present her methodology to senior intelligence officials from across NATO. She walked through the familiar hallways, past her old desk where she'd spent 3 years being invisible. Someone else sat there now, a young man named Thomas who looked up as she passed. He seemed surprised to see a director acknowledging his existence with a smile and a nod. The briefing room was packed with intelligence chiefs, military commanders, and civilian agency directors. General Hartmann introduced her with words that still felt surreal. Director Hill has revolutionized how we approach multinational intelligence integration. Her methodologies have prevented security threats, economic crises, and strategic miscalculations across Europe. As Irene began her presentation, she caught sight of General von Kessler entering the room. He took a seat in the back, his expression carrying the same analytical intensity she remembered from their first meeting. She presented for 90 minutes, walking through case studies that demonstrated how synchronized intelligence revealed patterns invisible to conventional analysis. Financial manipulation networks, coordinated security threats, political influence operations, all discovered by applying the same fundamental principle: align the data, and truth becomes visible. During the question period, a British intelligence director asked about her background. Director Hill, your approach is unconventional. Where did you train in intelligence analysis? Irene smiled. I didn't, sir. I was an administrative specialist who taught herself by reading classified summaries I was supposed to just format and file. Everything I know about intelligence work, I learned by paying attention when everyone assumed I wasn't. The room fell silent, then von Kessler spoke from the back. And that's exactly why her approach works. She sees what trained analysts miss because she's not constrained by conventional thinking. He stood and walked to the front of the room. Director Hill represents something important that our intelligence community needs to remember. Talent exists everywhere, but we only find it when we look beyond titles and credentials. He turned to address the assembled officials. How many of you have administrative staff, logistics coordinators, technical specialists who might be seeing patterns you're missing? How many potential analysts are you overlooking because they don't fit your expectations of what an intelligence professional should look like? The question hung in the air, challenging and uncomfortable. After the briefing, von Kessler asked Irene to walk with him. They strolled through the facility grounds, past the administrative offices where she'd once worked. You've built something remarkable, the general said. Not just an analytical methodology, but a new way of thinking about how we identify and develop talent. I just wanted to prove that being underestimated doesn't mean being less capable, Irene replied. Von Kessler stopped walking and looked at her directly. You've proven far more than that. You've shown that our greatest intelligence failures aren't technological or procedural. They're human. We fail when we can't see the capabilities right in front of us because we're too focused on credentials and titles. He paused, then continued. I'm recommending you for the European Intelligence Innovation Council. It's being established to rethink how we approach intelligence analysis across the alliance. I can't think of anyone better suited to lead that transformation. As Irene walked back to her car that evening, she passed the corner desk where her journey had begun. Thomas, the young administrative specialist, was still working despite the late hour, reviewing documents with the same careful attention she'd once brought to her own work. She stopped at his desk. "Working late?" Thomas looked up, startled. "Just trying to understand the strategic context, ma'am. It helps me format the briefings better if I know what the information means." Irene smiled, seeing herself in his answer. "Keep doing that. And if you ever notice patterns or discrepancies in the data you're formatting, don't be afraid to mention them. Someone might actually listen." As she drove home through the Stuttgart evening, Irene reflected on the journey from invisible admin to intelligence director. The story wasn't just about her success. It was about everyone who'd ever been dismissed, overlooked, or told they weren't qualified to contribute. They'd called her just admin. Until a 4-star general asked her name and saw what everyone else had missed. Now she was ensuring that others wouldn't have to wait as long as she had for someone to ask theirs. The future belonged to those who refused to accept limitations, who prepared themselves even when no one was watching, and who believed that capability mattered more than credentials. Irene Hill had proven that truth. And now she was helping others prove it too. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.